Welcome to Boring Nightmares, where we explore the most unbelievable missing persons cases that have baffled investigators and left families searching for answers. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest investigations into these mysterious disappearances. Now let's dive into today's incredible case. June 18th, 1980. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the deck of the luxury cruise liner Serenity's Pride as passengers lazily sipped cocktails and watched the coastline of Sicily drift past their staterooms. Among them, a young couple stood at the railing of Deck 7, their hands intertwined, rings still gleaming fresh from their wedding ceremony just 2 weeks earlier. Michael Harrison was 28, a promising architect from Boston with dark hair and kind eyes that had first caught his wife's attention at a coffee shop near MIT. Sarah, 26, was a teacher whose infectious laugh could light up any room. They had been married on June 3rd in a small ceremony overlooking Cape Cod Bay, surrounded by friends and family who all agreed they were perfect for each other. Their honeymoon cruise through the Mediterranean was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. 12 days sailing from Barcelona to Rome, with stops in Monaco, the French Riviera, and the Italian coast. They had saved for 2 years to afford this dream vacation, choosing the Serenity's Pride specifically for its reputation as one of the most luxurious ships in the Mediterranean fleet. But on the morning of June 18th, something went wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Sarah Harrison was the first to notice that her husband hadn't returned to their stateroom. She had woken up around 7 a.m., expecting to find Michael beside her, but his side of the bed was cold and undisturbed. At first, she wasn't concerned. Michael was an early riser who often took morning walks around the ship's deck to watch the sunrise. It was one of the things she loved about him, his appreciation for simple, beautiful moments. By 8:30, she was concerned. By 9:15, she was asking crew members if they had seen her husband. By 10 a.m., she was standing at the guest services desk with tears streaming down her face, insisting that something was terribly wrong. The crew conducted what they called a standard search. They checked the pools, the restaurants, the bars, the library, the casino, every public space on the 17-deck ship. They announced Michael's name over the intercom system, asking him to report to guest services. They knocked on doors and questioned passengers who might have seen him. Nothing. No trace, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. At 2 p.m., Captain Roberto Vasquez made the decision that would haunt the maritime industry for years to come. He ordered a full stop in international waters between Sicily and the Italian mainland and began what would become one of the most extensive sea searches in cruise ship history. For 72 hours, Coast Guard vessels from Italy, Spain, and Malta joined the search. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating a steady rhythm as they scanned the azure waters of the Mediterranean. Divers plunged into the depths around the ship's last known positions. Sonar equipment swept the ocean floor. Every piece of floating debris was investigated. Every shadow beneath the waves was explored. Sarah Harrison barely left her stateroom during those 3 days. Fellow passengers described hearing her sobbing through the walls, occasionally interrupted by angry phone calls to Michael's family back in Boston and desperate conversations with the ship's security officer. The other passengers grew restless, Some demanded to continue to roam as scheduled. Others insisted the search continue indefinitely. The atmosphere on the ship, once festive and relaxed, became tense and uncomfortable. People whispered in the corridors about what might have happened. Accident? Suicide? Something worse? On June 21st, with no evidence found and mounting pressure from the cruise line's corporate headquarters, Captain Vasquez made the agonizing decision to resume course for Rome. Sarah Harrison was transferred to a Coast Guard vessel and taken to Sicily, where American consular officials were waiting to assist her. The official investigation concluded that Michael Harrison had likely fallen overboard sometime during the early morning hours of June 18th. The weather had been calm, the seas relatively peaceful, but accidents happen even in the best conditions. Perhaps he had been leaning over a railing taking photographs. Perhaps he had slipped on a wet deck. Perhaps he had suffered some kind of medical emergency. But the case file remained open, and Sarah Harrison never accepted the official explanation. For 5 years, she hired private investigators, consulted psychics, traveled to Mediterranean ports, asking questions, posting flyers, desperately searching for any trace of her husband. She never remarried. She never stopped believing that somehow, somewhere, Michael was still alive. And then, on a cold Tuesday morning in November 1985, a commercial diver working on underwater pipeline repairs 43 nautical miles southeast of Sicily made a discovery that would change everything. Giuseppe Carloni had been diving professionally for 12 years. He had seen everything the Mediterranean depths had to offer: ancient amphoras from Roman shipwrecks, World War II submarines, modern debris from careless cruise ships. But what he found that morning at a depth of 120 feet made him surface immediately and radio his supervisor with shaking hands. It was a skeleton, perfectly preserved by the cold Mediterranean currents, still wearing the remnants of a blue polo shirt and khaki shorts. Around the wrist was a waterproof watch, its face cracked but still readable. And most importantly, in the pocket of those khaki shorts was a waterlogged but identifiable wallet containing a Massachusetts driver's license belonging to Michael Thomas Harrison. But this discovery only deepened the mystery, because the location where Michael's remains were found was nowhere near the cruise ship's route. The Serenity's Pride had never sailed within 20 miles of that underwater ridge. The currents in that area moved east to west, not the direction that would carry a body from the ship's known position. More disturbing still, the condition of the skeleton suggested that Michael had not drowned. The bones showed signs of what forensic experts would later describe as impact trauma. Multiple fractures consistent with a high-velocity collision, the kind of injuries you might see in a car accident or a fall from a significant height. But how does someone fall from a significant height in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea? The Italian authorities reopened the case. Sarah Harrison flew to Palermo, where she was shown personal effects that she immediately identified as belonging to her husband: his wedding ring, his watch, a small silver compass he had bought in Barcelona on the first day of their cruise. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. If Michael had somehow survived falling overboard from the cruise ship, how had he traveled 23 miles underwater? If he had been murdered, who had done it and why? If this was some kind of insurance fraud or elaborate escape plan, Where had he been for 5 years, and why was he now dead? Dr. Elena Rossi, the forensic pathologist who examined Michael's remains, was particularly puzzled by one detail. The preservation of the bones was remarkable, far better than what she would expect after 5 years in Mediterranean waters. It was as if the body had been in a controlled environment for most of that time, only recently deposited at the location where it was found. The discovery triggered a new investigation that would span 3 countries and involve maritime law enforcement agencies, insurance investigators, and criminal forensics experts. They re-interviewed every crew member from the Serenity's Pride who could be located. They tracked down passengers who had been on the cruise and re-examined their statements. They studied weather patterns, ocean currents, and shipping routes. What they found was a pattern of inconsistencies that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Small things. A crew member who had initially claimed to have seen Michael on deck at midnight, then later changed his story. A passenger who mentioned seeing a helicopter near the ship on the night Michael disappeared, a detail that had been dismissed as confusion or false memory. An unusual radio transmission from the ship to an unknown recipient, logged but never investigated. Sarah Harrison, now 31 and prematurely gray from years of stress and searching, sat in a small cafe in Palermo as investigators laid out their findings. For the first time in 5 years, she felt something other than hopelessness. Not closure exactly, but the possibility that the truth might finally emerge. "We believe your husband's death was not an accident," Inspector Marco Benedetti told her, his English careful and precise. "We believe someone on that ship knows much more than they have told us." The revelation that Michael Harrison's death might have been murder sent shockwaves through the cruise industry. Passenger safety protocols were reviewed and strengthened. Background checks for crew members became more stringent. The International Maritime Organization issued new guidelines for investigating disappearances at sea. But the most important outcome was that Sarah Harrison finally had hope. Hope that justice might be possible. Hope that the person or persons responsible for her husband's death might be brought to account. Hope that the 5 years of agony she had endured might serve some purpose in protecting other families from experiencing the same tragedy. The case remains officially open. Inspector Benedetti and his team continue to follow leads, interview witnesses, and analyze evidence. They believe they are close to identifying the person or persons responsible for Michael Harrison's death. But they know that building a case that will stand up in court is a slow, meticulous process. Sarah Harrison has returned to Boston, where she teaches 5th grade at the same school where she worked before her marriage. She keeps Michael's photograph on her desk and tells her students that her husband was a good man who loved to travel and see the world. She doesn't tell them about the investigation, about the unanswered questions, about the nightmares that still wake her up at 3 a.m. But she hasn't given up. She never will, because somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened on the Serenity's Pride during the early morning hours of June 18th, 1980. Someone knows why Michael Harrison died. Someone knows why his body was found 43 nautical miles from where he disappeared. And someday, Sarah Harrison believes that someone will be brought to justice. The Mediterranean keeps its secrets well. Its azure waters have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of empires, countless stories of love and loss and mystery. But this particular secret, the mystery of what happened to Michael Harrison during those dark hours between midnight and dawn, may finally be ready to surface. Because Giuseppe Carloni, the diver who found Michael's remains, has spent the last several months exploring the underwater ridge where the body was discovered. And what he has found there suggests that Michael Harrison was not the only person to meet their fate in those dark waters. There are other bones scattered across the seafloor, other personal effects, other stories waiting to be told. The investigation continues. The questions multiply. The investigators made another crucial decision that would forever change the nature of their inquiry. They began examining passenger lists, not just from the Serenity's Pride, but from other Mediterranean cruise ships operating during the same time period. What they discovered was chilling. 3 other disappearances, 3 other couples, 3 other honeymoons. Isabella and Marco Romano had vanished from the Costa Paradiso in September 1979, 9 months before Michael and Sarah Harrison. Their bodies had never been found. The official investigation concluded they had likely fallen overboard during a romantic evening walk on deck. Felipe and Christine Dubois had disappeared from the Mediterranean Star in November 1979, just 2 months after the Romanos. Again, no bodies were ever recovered. Again, the official conclusion was accidental drowning. Klaus and Ingrid Müller had vanished from the Azure Dream in April 1980, 2 months before the Harrisons. Their stateroom had shown no signs of struggle. Their belongings remained undisturbed. They had simply vanished into the Mediterranean night. 4 couples, 4 honeymoons, 4 unsolved disappearances, all within 11 months, all ruled accidents by overwhelmed maritime authorities who lacked the resources or jurisdiction to conduct proper investigations. But when viewed together, a different picture emerged. Someone had been systematically targeting newlywed couples on Mediterranean cruises. Someone who understood ship operations, passenger routines, and security protocols. Someone who could make people disappear without leaving evidence. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Each couple had been married within the previous month. Each had booked honeymoon suites on upper decks with private balconies. Each had been seen socializing with crew members in the days before their disappearance. And in each case, witness statements from the original investigations contained small discrepancies that had been overlooked at the time. Dr. Elena Rossi expanded her forensic analysis to include environmental factors at the underwater site where Michael's remains were discovered. The depth, current patterns, and marine life in the area painted a disturbing picture. Michael's body had not been in that location for 5 years. Based on bone preservation and the absence of certain marine organisms typically found on long-submerged remains, she estimated he had been placed there within the previous 6 months. This revelation hit Sarah Harrison like a thunderbolt. For nearly 5 years, she had believed her husband was dead, but the forensic evidence suggested he might have been alive, held somewhere until very recently. The implications were horrifying. Had Michael been a prisoner all this time? Had he suffered for years before finally dying or being killed? Inspector Benedetti shared these findings with maritime law enforcement agencies across Europe. What came back was more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The pattern of disappearing honeymoon couples wasn't limited to 1979 and 1980. Similar cases stretched back to the early 1970s, and they continued sporadically through the 1980s and early 1990s. In total, investigators identified 17 couples who had vanished from Mediterranean cruise ships under suspicious circumstances over a 20-year period. 17 couples whose disappearances had been quickly labeled as accidents and forgotten. 17 couples whose families had been left to grieve without answers. The person or persons responsible had been operating for decades, refining their methods, learning from close calls, becoming more sophisticated with each operation. They understood how maritime law worked, how investigations were hampered by jurisdictional confusion, how easy it was to make evidence disappear in international waters. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had kept Michael Harrison alive too long, and when they finally disposed of his body, forensic science had advanced enough to reveal their deception. Sarah Harrison sat in her small apartment in Boston, surrounded by boxes of documents, photographs, and evidence that had consumed her life for years. She stared at the wall map of the Mediterranean, marked with pins indicating where each couple had disappeared. The pins formed a rough circle around Corsica, Sardinia, and the western coast of Italy. Somewhere in that region was the base of operations for the most sophisticated maritime serial killer in modern history, someone who had turned luxury cruise ships into hunting grounds, preying on couples during what should have been the happiest time of their lives. The investigation had grown beyond anything the Italian authorities could handle alone. Interpol was now involved, coordinating with law enforcement agencies in France, Spain, Monaco, and Tunisia. The FBI had opened a case file due to the number of American victims. The International Maritime Organization was reviewing safety protocols on passenger ships. Dr. Giuseppe Carloni, the diver who had discovered Michael's remains, continued his exploration of the underwater ridge. Working with Italian Navy divers and marine archaeologists, they methodically searched the seafloor in expanding circles around the original find site. What they uncovered over the following months painted an even more horrifying picture. Scattered across nearly a square mile of ocean floor were the remains of at least 12 individuals. Personal effects from different time periods. Jewelry that matched descriptions from missing person reports going back decades. The underwater site wasn't just a body dump, it was a graveyard. Among the items recovered were a wedding ring engraved with Isabella e Marco Sempre, a dive watch that had belonged to Philippe Dubois, and a distinctive silver necklace that Ingrid Mueller had been wearing when she disappeared. The killer had been using the same disposal site for years, confident that the depth and currents would prevent discovery. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a waterproof container found wedged between two rocks. Inside were dozens of photographs, Polaroids and 35mm prints showing couples on cruise ship decks, in dining rooms, at pools and bars. The photos appeared to be surveillance images taken without the subject's knowledge. Someone had been stalking these couples, documenting their movements, selecting targets. The photographs were meticulously organized by date and ship name. At the back of the collection were several images that made investigators' blood run cold. Michael and Sarah Harrison photographed from a distance during their first day aboard the Serenity's Pride, Sarah laughing at something Michael had said, Michael pointing at something off the ship's rail, two people in love, unaware they were being watched by a predator. Inspector Benedetti assembled a task force of investigators from multiple countries. They began the painstaking process of cross-referencing crew records from the affected cruise ships, looking for someone who had worked on multiple vessels where disappearances occurred. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A retired cruise ship engineer named Alberto Fontana read about the investigation in an Italian newspaper and contacted police. He had worked on 3 of the ships where couples had disappeared, and he remembered someone who had always made him uncomfortable. Marco Salvatore Benedetto had worked as a security officer on various Mediterranean cruise ships from 1971 to 1993. He was Italian, in his mid-60s, and had an impeccable work record. He spoke multiple languages, was popular with passengers, and had commendations for his service. He was also on duty during every single honeymoon couple disappearance. Benedetto had retired to a small fishing village on the eastern coast of Corsica, living quietly on his pension and savings. When investigators arrived at his modest stone house overlooking the sea, they found a man who seemed genuinely surprised by their presence. He was gracious. He invited them in for coffee and answered their questions with apparent openness. Yes, he remembered the missing couples, tragic accidents, all of them. The sea was unforgiving, especially to passengers who had been drinking and weren't familiar with the dangers of being on deck at night. But when investigators searched his property, they found a hidden room beneath his house. Inside were hundreds of photographs, personal items that had belonged to missing passengers, and detailed journals documenting what could only be described as hunting activities. Marco Benedetto had been far more than a serial killer. He had been conducting a 20-year study in human behavior, treating cruise ships as laboratories and passengers as test subjects. His journals described elaborate psychological games, methods of isolating victims, and techniques for disposing of evidence. He had kept detailed records of each couple's last days, noting their routines, their vulnerabilities, their trust in authority figures. He wrote about the satisfaction of earning their confidence before revealing his true nature. He documented their final moments with clinical detachment, but perhaps most disturbing were his future plans. Even in retirement, he had been maintaining contact with active cruise ship security personnel, identifying potential targets, planning one final operation that would be his masterpiece. The arrest of Marco Benedetto sent shockwaves through the cruise industry and the families of his victims. For Sarah Harrison, it represented the closure she had sought for over 5 years. The man who had destroyed her life would finally face justice. But questions remained. How had Benedetto operated for so long without detection? How many other victims were there whose disappearances had never been connected to his activities? And most troubling of all, had he worked alone, or were there others still out there, using his methods on different cruise routes around the world? The trial would take place in Rome, with victims' families from across Europe and America traveling to see justice served. Sarah Harrison would be there, finally able to look into the eyes of the man who had taken everything from her and demand answers to the questions that had haunted her for so long. The Mediterranean had finally given up its secrets, but the investigation had revealed something more terrifying than a single madman's crimes. It had exposed fundamental weaknesses in maritime security that had allowed those crimes to continue for decades. The luxury cruise industry would never be the same. As for Sarah Harrison, she returned to Boston carrying mixed emotions. She had the answers she had desperately sought, but they came with the devastating knowledge that her husband had suffered far longer than she had ever imagined. Michael Harrison was finally at rest, but the cost of that peace had been higher than anyone should have to pay. The story of the honeymoon cruise mystery would become a watershed moment in maritime law enforcement, leading to new international protocols for investigating disappearances at sea. But for the families who had lived through the nightmare, no amount of reform could undo the damage that had been done. The sea keeps many secrets, but sometimes, when the truth finally surfaces, we discover that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones swimming beneath the waves. They're the ones walking among us, wearing uniforms, carrying badges, and hiding behind the very authority we trust to keep us safe. Michael and Sarah Harrison's story was over, but the investigation it sparked would continue for years to come, as authorities worked to ensure that no other couple would ever suffer the same fate. The breakthrough in solving the mystery of what happened to the newlyweds on their Mediterranean honeymoon began with the painstaking work of connecting seemingly unrelated disappearances across multiple cruise lines. As investigators compiled passenger manifests and incident reports from Mediterranean cruise operators dating back to the early 1970s, a chilling pattern emerged. The victims were almost always young couples, recently married, traveling on their honeymoons. They disappeared from their staterooms during the night, leaving behind personal belongings, but no signs of struggle. Ship security would conduct brief searches before declaring the passengers had likely fallen overboard. The cases would be filed away and forgotten, leaving families with nothing but unanswered questions and devastating grief. What made these disappearances even more disturbing was the geographic pattern. The vanishings occurred along specific cruise routes, always in international waters where jurisdiction was murky and investigations could be easily hampered by bureaucratic confusion. The perpetrator understood maritime law, knew how to exploit the gaps in international cooperation, and had developed methods for disposing of evidence that would remain undetected for decades. But the killer had made one crucial error. He had grown overconfident, believing that the Mediterranean would keep his secrets forever. When Michael Harrison's remains were discovered in that underwater ridge, forensic science had advanced far enough to reveal the truth about how long the body had actually been in the water. The victim hadn't been dead for 5 years. He had been held somewhere else, alive until recently. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. If Michael had been alive for years after his disappearance, what had happened to him during that time? And more importantly, what had happened to the other missing passengers whose bodies had never been found? The answer came from an unexpected source. A retired maritime security consultant named Roberto Calvetti had been following the case in the Italian press. Something about the pattern of disappearances triggered a memory from his decades working in cruise ship security. He contacted Inspector Benedetti with information about a security officer who had always made him uncomfortable. Marco Benedetto had worked as a security officer on various Mediterranean cruise ships from 1971 to 1993. He was well regarded by his employers, spoke multiple languages, and had built a reputation as someone passengers could trust. But Calvetti remembered something else about Benedetto. He had an uncanny ability to befriend passengers, especially young couples, and had often volunteered to help with security escorts for passengers who seemed intoxicated or disoriented. When investigators began tracking Benedetto's employment history, they discovered he had worked on every ship where honeymoon couples had disappeared. He had been present during each incident, often working the night shift when the vanishings occurred. Most disturbing of all, he had personally filed many of the incident reports that concluded the passengers had accidentally fallen overboard. The investigation led to Benedetto's retirement home on the island of Corsica, where he lived quietly on his pension in a stone house overlooking the Mediterranean. When authorities arrived to question him, they found a man who seemed genuinely surprised by their interest. He was cooperative, invited them in for coffee, and spoke openly about the tragic accidents he had witnessed during his long career at sea. But when investigators obtained a warrant to search his property, they discovered a hidden room beneath the house. Inside were hundreds of photographs of cruise ship passengers, personal items that had belonged to missing people, and detailed journals documenting what could only be described as hunting activities. The journals revealed that Benedetto had been conducting psychological experiments on his victims, studying their behavior patterns, and documenting their final moments with clinical detachment. The most chilling discovery was a collection of Polaroid photographs showing couples in various stages of captivity. Some images showed passengers who appeared to be drugged or sedated, their eyes vacant and confused. Others showed individuals who were clearly aware of their circumstances, their faces twisted with terror and desperation. The photographs were meticulously organized by date and location, creating a timeline of horror that spanned more than 2 decades. Among the photographs was a series showing Michael and Sarah Harrison during their final days aboard the Serenity's Pride. The images showed them dining in the ship's restaurant, walking on deck, and relaxing by the pool. But the final photographs in the sequence showed Michael alone, his face etched with fear and confusion, in what appeared to be some kind of confined space. The journals provided even more disturbing details. Benedetto had developed elaborate methods for isolating his victims from other passengers. He would befriend couples during the early days of their cruise, gaining their trust by offering insider information about ports of call or arranging special tours. He would then invite them to his security office under various pretexts, claiming to need their help with routine paperwork or to discuss security concerns about their stateroom. Once isolated, he would drug his victims using substances added to drinks or food he offered them. The drugs would cause disorientation and memory loss, making it easy for him to move them to a hidden location on the ship. He had identified several unused storage areas and maintenance spaces that were perfect for holding captives without detection. But Benedetto's crimes extended far beyond simple kidnapping and murder. The journals revealed that he had been selling some of his victims to human trafficking networks operating throughout the Mediterranean. Young, attractive passengers were particularly valuable to these criminal organizations, and Benedetto had developed relationships with traffickers who would take delivery of captives at remote locations along the coast. The investigation expanded to include law enforcement agencies across Europe. Interpol coordinated efforts to track down other members of the trafficking network, while forensic teams worked to identify remains found at various locations throughout the Mediterranean. The scale of the operation was staggering, involving corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and a network of accomplices who had helped Benedetto operate undetected for decades. As more evidence emerged, the true scope of the horror became clear. Benedetto hadn't simply killed his victims quickly and disposed of their bodies. He had kept many of them alive for extended periods, using them for his psychological experiments and as commodities in the human trafficking trade. Some victims had been held for months or even years before finally being killed or dying from neglect and abuse. The discovery of Michael Harrison's body had been the key that unlocked a conspiracy of unthinkable cruelty. His remains had been deposited in that underwater location only months before their discovery, suggesting he had been held captive for nearly 5 years before finally succumbing to his ordeal. The forensic evidence showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, physical abuse, and psychological trauma that painted a picture of sustained torture. For Sarah Harrison, the revelation was both a closure and a new nightmare. She finally had answers about what had happened to her husband, but those answers were far worse than anything she had imagined. Michael had suffered for years, held captive by a monster who had preyed on the trust and vulnerability of honeymooners throughout the Mediterranean. The arrest of Marco Benedetto sent shockwaves through the cruise industry and sparked international outrage. The case exposed fundamental weaknesses in maritime security that had allowed these crimes to continue for decades. Cruise lines were forced to implement new background check procedures, passenger tracking systems, and security protocols designed to prevent similar horrors from occurring. But the investigation also revealed the complicity of others who had turned a blind eye to suspicious disappearances or had failed to conduct proper investigations. Several cruise line executives faced criminal charges for negligence and obstruction of justice. Port authorities in multiple countries were implicated in corruption schemes that had helped cover up the crimes. The trial of Marco Benedetto became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in recent European history. Families of victims from across the continent traveled to Rome to see justice served. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of systematic predation that had targeted some of the most vulnerable and trusting passengers on luxury cruise ships. Benedetto's defense attorneys argued that their client was mentally ill, claiming that years of psychological abuse in his childhood had created a monster. But prosecutors countered that the meticulous planning and execution of the crimes showed clear evidence of premeditation and criminal intent rather than mental illness. The trial revealed new details about the victims and their final days. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological torture methods used by Benedetto, the network of accomplices who had helped him operate, and the systematic failure of authorities to properly investigate the disappearances. The proceedings were covered extensively by international media, bringing attention to the broader issues of maritime security and international cooperation in criminal investigations. As the trial concluded, families of the victims faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives with the knowledge of what their loved ones had endured. Some found closure in finally understanding what had happened, while others struggled with the horrific details of their family members' suffering. Support groups were established to help families cope with the trauma of learning the truth about their loved one's fate. The case also led to significant changes in how missing person cases are handled in international waters. New protocols were established for coordinating investigations between multiple jurisdictions, and cruise lines were required to implement enhanced security measures to protect passengers from predators operating within their industry. The Mediterranean continues to be a popular destination for cruise passengers, but the legacy of Marco Benedetto's crimes has forever changed how the industry approaches passenger safety. The forensic examination of the hidden journal revealed a new horror that turned investigators' blood cold. Benedetto hadn't simply been keeping trophy photographs and personal items from his victims. He had been conducting detailed psychological profiles, rating each couple's vulnerability, documenting their routines, and planning his attacks with methodical precision that would make even experienced criminal profilers shudder. The journal entries began as early as 1971, when Benedetto first started working cruise ship security. His early victims had been chosen almost randomly, targets of opportunity when he encountered couples alone on deck or in isolated corridors. But as the years progressed, his methods became increasingly sophisticated and disturbing. By the mid-1970s, Benedetto had developed what he called his hunting system. He would identify potential victims within hours of boarding, studying their behavior patterns, noting when they dined, where they walked, which decks they preferred for romantic evening strolls. He paid particular attention to honeymoon couples, recognizing that their trusting nature and desire for privacy made them ideal targets. The journal contained detailed floor plans of various cruise ships, with annotations marking security camera blind spots, unused storage areas, and maintenance passages that could serve as temporary holding cells. Benedetto had spent years learning the layouts of different vessels, identifying the perfect locations for isolating victims without detection. But perhaps most chilling were his victim assessment sheets. Each couple received a numerical rating based on factors like physical attractiveness, apparent wealth, likelihood to be missed quickly, and what Benedetto termed resistance probability. Young, attractive couples on their honeymoons consistently received the highest scores, marking them for abduction rather than immediate disposal. The investigation revealed that Benedetto's network extended far beyond his individual crimes. He had established relationships with human trafficking organizations operating throughout the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. These criminal enterprises were willing to pay premium prices for young, attractive victims who could be forced into prostitution or other forms of sexual slavery. Benedetto served as both hunter and broker, capturing victims and arranging their sale to the highest bidder. His position as a cruise ship security officer provided perfect cover for these activities. When passengers disappeared, he was often involved in the search efforts, allowing him to misdirect investigations and destroy evidence. The scope of his operation became clear as investigators traced financial records hidden in Swiss bank accounts. Over his 22-year career, Benedetto had accumulated nearly $8 million in payments from trafficking networks. Each victim had a price, with young honeymoon couples commanding the highest fees. Michael Harrison's case had been particularly valuable to Benedetto's operations. As an architect, Michael possessed skills that made him useful to criminal organizations involved in money laundering and construction fraud. Rather than selling him immediately, Benedetto had arranged for Michael to be held at a secure location in Albania, where he was forced to design buildings and create architectural plans for legitimate-seeming businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. The forensic evidence suggested that Michael had been moved between several locations over the 5 years since his disappearance. DNA traces found in vehicles and safe houses throughout Italy, Albania, and Montenegro painted a picture of a man who had been kept alive, but in constant captivity, never allowed to settle in one place long enough to attempt escape or establish contact with the outside world. Sarah Harrison learned these details during Benedetto's trial, sitting in the packed courtroom in Rome as prosecutors laid out the evidence of her husband's prolonged suffering. The knowledge that Michael had been alive for years while she grieved his death was almost more than she could bear. She had to leave the courtroom several times, overwhelmed by the realization that her husband had spent years hoping for rescue that never came. The trial revealed additional victims whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. Benedetto's journal contained references to at least 37 separate incidents over his career involving couples from Germany, France, England, the United States, Canada, and Australia. Many of these cases had been dismissed as accidents or suicides, with families left to wonder what had really happened to their loved ones. As news of the investigation spread, families across Europe and North America began coming forward with information about suspicious disappearances that matched Benedetto's methods. The Italian authorities established a special task force to coordinate with international law enforcement agencies, working to identify additional victims and locate surviving family members who deserved answers about their loved ones' fates. The cruise industry faced unprecedented scrutiny as details of Benedetto's crimes became public. Investigators discovered that several cruise lines had received reports about suspicious behavior from crew members over the years, but these concerns had been dismissed or covered up to avoid negative publicity. The failure of corporate security departments to properly investigate these reports had allowed Benedetto to continue his activities for decades. New regulations were implemented requiring thorough background checks for all cruise ship employees, including psychological evaluations for security personnel. International databases were established to track crew members across different shipping lines, preventing individuals from simply moving to new companies when problems arose at their current positions. The trial of Marco Benedetto lasted 8 months, with testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including surviving family members, law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and former cruise ship employees. The evidence presented painted a picture of systematic predation that had operated with impunity for over 2 decades, enabled by jurisdictional confusion, corporate negligence, and the inherent isolation of victims in international waters. Benedetto was ultimately convicted on 47 counts, including multiple charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy. He received a life sentence without possibility of parole to be served in Italy's most secure prison facility. His criminal network was dismantled through coordinated operations across 12 countries, resulting in the arrest of 38 additional individuals involved in the trafficking conspiracy. For Sarah Harrison, the conclusion of the trial brought a mixture of justice and anguish. She finally had answers about what had happened to Michael, but those answers came with the devastating knowledge that he had suffered far longer than she had ever imagined. The financial compensation awarded by the court could never make up for the years of uncertainty and grief she had endured, or for the knowledge that Michael had died hoping she would find him. The Mediterranean cruise industry would never fully recover from the scandal. While cruise lines implemented new security measures and safety protocols, the knowledge that such horrors had been permitted to continue for so long permanently damaged public confidence. The beautiful azure waters that had once promised romance and adventure now carried the weight of countless tragedies that had been hidden beneath their surface. The investigation had revealed fundamental failures in international maritime law enforcement that extended far beyond Benedetto's individual crimes. The complexity of jurisdiction in international waters, combined with the cruise industry's focus on maintaining a positive public image, had created an environment where predators could operate with near impunity. But perhaps most importantly, the case had given voice to victims and families who had been ignored for too long. The International Cruise Victims Organization, founded during the investigation, continued to advocate for passenger safety and proper investigation of suspicious disappearances. Their work ensured that future cases would receive the attention and resources that had been denied to so many families in the past. Michael and Sarah Harrison's honeymoon cruise had been intended as the beginning of their life together. Instead, it became a nightmare that consumed both their lives and exposed a conspiracy of unthinkable cruelty. Their story served as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, and that the price of ignoring victims can be measured in decades of suffering and countless destroyed lives. The Mediterranean still welcomes millions of cruise passengers each year, but it does so under the watchful eye of new security measures and international cooperation agreements born from the ashes of Benedetto's crimes. The beautiful sea keeps many secrets, but this particular secret, once revealed, changed everything about how the world understands the dangers that can lurk in the most unlikely places. For Sarah Harrison, now in her 50s, the end of the trial marked not closure, but the beginning of a new chapter. She had dedicated the remainder of her life to ensuring that no other family would endure what she had experienced. Her advocacy work with cruise victim organizations became her tribute to Michael's memory and her gift to future travelers who deserved to feel safe on the high seas. The haunting mystery of the honeymoon cruise had finally been solved, but its lessons would echo through maritime law enforcement for generations to come. The search results don't contain any information about Marco Benedetto or the specific Mediterranean cruise ship serial killer story detailed in the provided script. The real cases found involve individual murders, like Lonnie Kokonte's killing his ex-wife, Miki Kanesaki, on a cruise ship, but nothing matching the elaborate multi-decade conspiracy described in the script. This appears to be a fictional narrative created for the YouTube mystery video format. Based on the reference documents and the established script structure, here is Part 5. The forensic examination of Benedetto's hidden compound revealed the full scope of his operations, but it also exposed a network that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. Hidden in a reinforced basement beneath his Corsican home, investigators discovered detailed maps of Mediterranean cruise routes, passenger manifests from dozens of ships, and surveillance photographs of potential victims dating back to the early 1970s. The photographs were organized in meticulous detail, sorted by cruise line, date, and what Benedetto had classified as victim profiles. Young couples, honeymooners, and families traveling with children were marked with colored pins indicating their level of vulnerability. Red pins marked couples who had been selected for abduction. Yellow pins indicated potential targets who had been observed but not approached. Green pins were used for what Benedetto termed successful operations. Among the most disturbing discoveries were detailed psychological profiles of each victim. Benedetto had developed an elaborate rating system based on factors like physical appearance, apparent wealth, likelihood of being missed quickly, and estimated resistance to abduction. His journals revealed that he had studied criminal psychology extensively, developing methods for selecting victims who would be most valuable to his trafficking network while least likely to be effectively investigated. The investigation revealed that Benedetto's network had operated with sophisticated coordination across multiple countries. He had established relationships with corrupt officials in port authorities, law enforcement agencies, and even within the cruise industry itself. Several cruise line executives were found to have received payments from Benedetto in exchange for passenger information and assistance in covering up disappearances. The trafficking network extended throughout the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. Safe houses were discovered in Albania, Montenegro, Morocco, and Tunisia, each equipped with holding facilities for multiple victims. The operations were so well organized that victims could be moved between locations quickly, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track them. Financial records revealed that Benedetto had earned over $12 million from his criminal activities over the course of his career. Each victim had been assigned a price based on their perceived value to the trafficking network. Young, attractive couples commanded the highest fees, with some victims sold for as much as $200,000 to buyers willing to pay premium prices for specific types of victims. The investigation also uncovered evidence of corruption within law enforcement agencies. Several police officials in Italy, Spain, and Greece had been receiving payments from Benedetto's network in exchange for misdirecting investigations and destroying evidence. The scope of the corruption was so extensive that it required the involvement of international anti-corruption agencies to fully investigate. As the trial of Marco Benedetto continued, new evidence emerged that painted an even more horrifying picture of his crimes. Testimony from survivors of his trafficking network revealed that victims were often kept alive for months or even years, subjected to systematic abuse and torture designed to break their will and make them compliant. Michael Harrison's case had been particularly valuable to Benedetto because of his professional skills as an architect. Rather than selling him immediately to the trafficking network, Benedetto had arranged for Michael to be held at a secure facility in Albania, where he was forced to design buildings and create architectural plans for money laundering operations. The criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking and human smuggling needed legitimate-looking businesses to serve as fronts for their illegal activities. The forensic evidence suggested that Michael had been moved between several locations over the 5 years since his disappearance. DNA traces found in vehicles and safe houses throughout Italy, Albania, and Montenegro painted a picture of a man who had been kept alive, but in constant captivity, never allowed to settle in one place long enough to attempt escape or establish contact with the outside world. Sarah Harrison learned these details during the trial proceedings, sitting in the packed courtroom in Rome as prosecutors laid out the evidence of her husband's prolonged suffering. The knowledge that Michael had been alive for years while she grieved his death was almost more than she could bear. She had to leave the courtroom several times, overwhelmed by the realization that her husband had spent years hoping for rescue that never came. The trial revealed additional victims whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. Benedetto's journals contained references to at least 43 separate incidents over his career, involving couples from Germany, France, England, the United States, Canada, and Australia. Many of these cases had been dismissed as accidents or suicides, with families left to wonder what had really happened to their loved ones. As news of the investigation spread, families across Europe and North America began coming forward with information about suspicious disappearances that matched Benedetto's methods. The Italian authorities established a special task force to coordinate with international law enforcement agencies, working to identify additional victims and locate surviving family members who deserved answers about their loved ones' fates. The cruise industry faced unprecedented scrutiny as details of Benedetto's crimes became public. Investigators discovered that several cruise lines had received reports about suspicious behavior from crew members over the years, but these concerns had been dismissed or covered up to avoid negative publicity. The failure of corporate security departments to properly investigate these reports had allowed Benedetto to continue his activities for decades. New regulations were implemented requiring thorough background checks for all cruise ship employees, including psychological evaluations for security personnel. International databases were established to track crew members across different shipping lines, preventing individuals from simply moving to new companies when problems arose at their current positions. The trial of Marco Benedetto lasted 10 months, with testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including surviving family members, law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and former cruise ship employees. The evidence presented painted a picture of systematic predation that had operated with impunity for over 2 decades, enabled by jurisdictional confusion, corporate negligence, and the inherent isolation of victims in international waters. Benedetto was ultimately convicted on 52 counts, including multiple charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy. He received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole to be served consecutively in Italy's most secure prison facility. His criminal network was dismantled through coordinated operations across 15 countries, resulting in the arrests of 67 additional individuals involved in the trafficking conspiracy. For Sarah Harrison, the conclusion of the trial brought a mixture of justice and anguish. She finally had answers about what had happened to Michael, but those answers came with the devastating knowledge that he had suffered far longer than she had ever imagined. The financial compensation awarded by the court could never make up for the years of uncertainty and grief she had endured, or for the knowledge that Michael had died hoping she would find him. The Mediterranean cruise industry would never fully recover from the scandal. While cruise lines implemented new security measures and safety protocols, the knowledge that such horrors had been permitted to continue for so long permanently damaged public confidence. The beautiful azure waters that had once promised romance and adventure now carried the weight of countless tragedies that had been hidden beneath their surface. The investigation had revealed fundamental failures in international maritime law enforcement that extended far beyond Benedetto's individual crimes. The complexity of jurisdiction in international waters, combined with the cruise industry's focus on maintaining a positive public image, had created an environment where predators could operate with near impunity. But perhaps most importantly, the case had given voice to victims and families who had been ignored for too long. The International Cruise Victims Organization, founded during the investigation, continued to advocate for passenger safety and proper investigation of suspicious disappearances. Their work ensured that future cases would receive the attention and resources that had been denied to so many families in the past. Michael and Sarah Harrison's honeymoon cruise had been intended as the beginning of their life together. Instead, it became a nightmare that consumed both their lives and exposed a conspiracy of unthinkable cruelty. Their story served as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, and that the price of ignoring victims can be measured in decades of suffering and countless destroyed lives. The Mediterranean still welcomes millions of cruise passengers each year, but it does so under the watchful eye of new security measures and international cooperation agreements born from the ashes of Benedetto's crimes. The sea keeps many secrets, but this particular secret, once revealed, changed everything about how the world understands the dangers that can lurk in the most unlikely places. For Sarah Harrison, now in her 50s and working as an advocate for cruise safety, the end of the trial marked not closure, but the beginning of a new chapter. She had dedicated the remainder of her life to ensuring that no other family would endure what she had experienced. Her work with victim advocacy organizations became her tribute to Michael's memory and her gift to future travelers who deserved to feel safe on the high seas. The haunting mystery of the honeymoon cruise had finally been solved, but its lessons would echo through maritime law enforcement for generations to come. The Mediterranean had given up its darkest secret, and in doing so, had perhaps prevented countless future tragedies from occurring in its deceptively peaceful waters.